government of Switzerland organized a high-level international conference back in April, and these are for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. And according to President Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine, he's saying that actually these peace talks are legitimate. Everything's on the table, basically. More than 100 countries are invited to it, and those talks are about to start just very soon, in fact, in about a week, on June 15th and June 16th. But behind the scenes right now, there are alleged efforts to sabotage the hope for peace. And there's some really important things to talk about on what's actually causing that and what the interests are. Now, during a recent speech, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused the Chinese Communist Party of pressuring countries, again, there's 100 of them, right, more than 100, pressuring them to not join the peace talks. And this is important because the CCP is pushing for its own peace deal. They have an alternative one they want, but also on the terms of the Chinese Communist Party and heavily in the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, first, let me show you what Zelensky said about the CCP interference at the Shangri-La dialogue. Watch.
Russia, using Chinese influence on the region, using Chinese diplomats also, does everything to disrupt peace summit. Regrettably, it is unfortunate that such big, independent, powerful country as China is an instrument in hands of Putin.
Here's a bit more context that from ABC News. ABC News said, speaking at Asia's premier security conference, Zelensky said that China is pressuring other countries and the leaders to not attend the upcoming talks. Notably, Zelensky is saying that Russia is doing it and that China is influencing them. I'll explain my take on that in a bit. Zelensky did not say which countries that they're being blocked, by the way, as well. There's more than 100. There could be a lot of them. ABC News notes, though, that China has staked out what it says is a neutral position on the war, putting it at odds with Ukraine, the United States, and most of Europe. Its trade with Russia has grown, easing the economic impact of Western sanctions. And American and Ukrainian and other intelligence agencies say there is evidence that Chinese parts are winding up in Russian weaponry. In fact, kind of proven now, they're saying, right? Even if China is not directly arming its neighbor, because it's weapon parts, not weapons, right? That says the Swiss had been hoping China would attend the peace conference in mid-June, but Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning signaled on Friday that that was unlikely. China has been calling for a peace conference with equal participation of all sides, including Russia, which has not been invited. And they added, quote, there is still a clear gap between the arrangements for the meeting and the demands of the Chinese side, as well as the general expectations of the international community, Mao said. And he added, quote, this makes it difficult for China to participate in the meeting. It notes as well the foreign ministry did not respond immediately to request for comments on Zelensky's accusation. But it notes the Ukrainian leader, Zelensky, said of China's pressure on others that it is not only support to Russia, that is basically support of war. Now, a few key points on this, right, from my take. The Chinese Communist Party is saying it will not attend the peace talks because there's a, quote, gap between the arrangements for the meeting and the demands of the Chinese side. The Chinese side in the Russian peace talks. That raises some real important questions then of what are the demands of the CCP's interests in the Russia-Ukraine war. Why does the CCP have a stake in that? What do they want to get out of it? Since when did the Chinese Communist Party even have a side in that war, right? You'd think that if their interest is in maybe helping Russia win or helping bring an end to it, then they'd be up for the peace talks, and maybe that would be how things go. But they're not. Their interests are something else. And then, again, what are the actual interests in keeping that war going? Why would the CCP want to extend it?
Morning.
What do they want to get out of this? Now, look, on Russia's side, according to them, they're running out of troops, right? It's been devastating to the country in many ways. It's been devastating to Ukraine in many ways. Both sides lost a large portion of their fighting force in the early parts of the war. And of course, they're both struggling to keep it going. Russia's keeping it going heavily through support now from China. And of course, Zelensky is keeping it going heavily from the support of Western Europe and the United States. Now, after Zelensky spoke at the Shangri-La Defense Forum in Singapore, he then went to Manila in the Philippines, and he met with President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. I'll be talking more about that important part after a quick break. Back. After Zelensky spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue at the Defense Forum in Singapore, he then went to Manila in the Philippines, and there he met with President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. That's the president of the Philippines. And AP says that Marcos pledged that his country would take part in the peace summit. Philippine Communications Secretary Chilo Garofil said, and he said, "quote I'm happy to hear today from you that you'll participate in our peace talks," for Zelensky. And Zelensky added, "It's a very strong signal." And notes that the White House said Vice President Kamala Harris will represent the United States at the meeting in Lucerne on June 15th, coming up very soon again. But notes that Zelensky said Ukraine needs more mental health workers for its soldiers, and Marcos, the president of the Philippines, promised to help and also welcomed a decision by Ukraine to open an embassy in Manila this year, which would hasten efforts to deliver assistance. He said, quote, "We have ourselves been trying to promote the continuing adherence to international law in our part of the world," Marcos said. And he added, "The issue that you are facing are similar. The issues you are facing are similar and in parallel to ours. Therefore, the position the Philippines takes is always to promote peace." And that's a loaded statement, because what's happening right now, what are the issues the Philippines is facing? Well, they're facing conflicts with the Chinese Communist Party in the South China Sea. In fact, they recently had some borderline, almost real military conflicts between some of their ships and the Chinese ships. They're really facing off with the Chinese Communist Party. And interestingly, during that conversation, it says that both leaders spoke critically of China at the Singapore Forum, which was attended by top defense and government officials from around the world, including from Washington and Beijing. And as the talks were held amid the raging wars in Gaza and Ukraine, as well as growing tensions and rivalry for influence between the United States and China in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, again, this is raising the point that these conflicts are not isolated. They're actually intertwined. And one of the key points that intertwines a lot of them is, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party. That raises some questions, and back to what the Chinese Foreign Ministry is saying, suggesting that the Ukraine peace deal needs to have something that fits the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And since when did the Chinese Communist Party have a stake in the war with Russia and Ukraine? That is the real question. Now, it seems that opposition to the CCP is something shared by both the Philippine president and, of course, Zelensky. And the deal they're working out is really having a focus on opposing the efforts of the CCP to influence the diplomacy of other nations. Both of them, the context of their meeting, whether it's the Philippines facing off against the CCP or Ukraine dealing with what Zelensky is saying is CCP interference to try to stop a peace deal. Both of them are dealing with the Chinese Communist Party trying to influence other nations amid growing conflicts. Now, this is important because, remember, there are different interests with the war in Ukraine. There's mixed views on whether the Western support for the war and whether people want that. And that's a big talk in the U.S. But remember that many Western leaders have repeatedly criticized the war as having derailed a lot of other agendas. A lot of them don't like it, even though they're funding it, right? Helping Ukraine defend itself, right? This is part of the broader context here. Some people would say, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party says, well, we supply weapons to Russia, but doesn't the U.S. supply weapons to Ukraine? And the CCP can say, well, they supply weapons to Russia, but America supplies weapons to Taiwan. The difference is this. The CCP is giving weapons to the aggressor. The United States is giving weapons to the people defending themselves against those acts. For example, giving weapons to Taiwan, if the CCP were to invade it, is not supplying an aggressive action. It's supplying a defensive action. That's the difference. But on this, though, remember that a lot of these Western leaders, whether it's Western Europe, whether it's Biden, a lot of them have criticized Russia for the war in Ukraine. A lot of them don't want it, even though, again, they're backing Ukraine in the war. Because they're saying that the war in Ukraine derailed a lot of other agendas. The green agenda in the West, was seriously interfered with because of the war in Ukraine. And a lot of other similar pushes are really crippled by the Russia-Ukraine war. Notably, the war caused energy problems throughout Europe. And, when they were trying, if you're going to try to transition to solar panels and wind turbines and stuff, you kind of need a good infrastructure to fall back on. A lot of that infrastructure was disrupted because a lot of energy comes from Russia. Russia has a monopoly on the energy infrastructure. And so as countries were trying to move to be energy independent, they had to have a breaking away process. But that was interfered with, of course, by the war. It's also putting a strain on food supplies. Ukraine is one of the bread baskets of the world. And it's also draining a significant amount of money that could have gone elsewhere. The U.S. in particular spent a lot of money on that. And also it had the unfortunate effect of pushing Russia closer to China, something I personally don't think they necessarily wanted to do. Even Russia has found itself in a very difficult position internationally. Because, look, a few key points on this, right? The Chinese Communist Party has been capitalizing on this. One of the most unfortunate, at least in my opinion, parts of this whole war is that Russia has been pushed very close to China. And as the war drags on, they're getting deeper and deeper into that, and it's becoming more and more difficult for them to pull out of it. A peace deal, if done in the way the West is talking about it, could have the effect of freeing Russia from the grips of the Chinese Communist Party. And I will go into this, but based on some of what's happening right now, it seems the CCP's interests are not only to maintain the war, but also to deepen Russian dependence on the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, some people are saying, and a lot of analysis going around on this, that Russia risks becoming a satellite state of the Chinese Communist Party because of the trade imbalances and because of their growing independence on the Chinese Communist Party, if things are not played well. Remember, the Chinese Communist Party has capitalized on this in major ways. They're benefiting more than anybody. That includes on energy, that includes on natural resources, that especially includes diplomacy and global influence, because they're building an alternate global world order. And again, they're using Russia, and again, as Russia gets cut off from the rest of the world, using that environment to gain control over that influence. Now, AP noted that China has surged sales to Russia of machine tools, microelectronics, and other technology that Moscow in turn is using to produce missiles, tanks, aircraft, and other weaponry for its use in the war against Ukraine, according to U.S. assessment. It notes that two senior Biden administration officials who discussed the sensitive findings on April 12th on the condition of anonymity said that in 2023, about 90% of Russia's microelectronics came from China, which Russia has used to make missiles, tanks, and aircraft. Nearly 70% of Russia's approximately $900 million in machine tool imports in the last quarter of 2023 came from China. And notes that Chinese and Russian entities have also been working to jointly produce unmanned aerial vehicles inside Russia. And Chinese companies are likely providing Russia with nitrocellulose used in the manufacture of ammunition, the officials said. In other words, without the Chinese Communist Party, Russia probably would have been forced to sit down at the negotiating table. The Chinese Communist Party on the Russia side is making it so that not only is it dangerous for Russia to step down from this and back off from it because of the risks they face from the West, but also the Chinese Communist Party is making it so that Russia, again, can maintain the war on its side because, again, they're getting supplies they need and the support they need. In other words, this war is going to drag on, and the interest parties on either side are now the Western world, and I would argue even Russia has interest in making a peace deal, and the Chinese Communist Party and its interests on the other side. Remember, this type of CCP support for Russia in its war was said to be a red line in the past, by the way. On the U.S. side, they were saying that if the Chinese Communist Party begins supplying weapons to Russia, that is a line in the sand. The CCP seems to have found a gray area with this, though, because they're not technically sending tanks and unmanned aerial vehicles and ammunition to Russia. They're sending the key ingredients and key parts for Russia to manufacture, and then they're working inside Russia to then be part of the manufacturing process. And remember, I talked about the problem that Russia risks becoming a satellite state of the Chinese Communist Party if they become increasingly dependent on the Chinese Communist Party. If, for example, the Chinese Communist Party moves its manufacturing base into Russia, still controlled by the CCP, and on the terms of the Chinese Communist Party because Russia needs it, well, again, if the CCP controls the food supply, what does that make the one who needs the food, right? But the CCP also has a clear interest in keeping the war going. And Zelensky is now saying that the CCP's current actions will have the effect of drawing out the war. A war that could have been over right now, a war that should have peace deals, and there is one coming up, could be drawn out because the CCP, not only through its support and otherwise, is actively doing this, but because as Russia is even interested in joining peace talks, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to prevent those peace talks. They want the war to go on for some reason. Now, CNN notes that China's support to Russia will extend the war in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky said Sunday as he called on countries across the Asia-Pacific region to join an upcoming peace summit he accused Russia of trying to thwart. Again, by way of China, right? And he said, quote, "With China's support to Russia, the war will last longer. That is bad for the whole world. And the policy of China, Chinese Communist Party, who declares that it supports territorial integrity and sovereignty and declares it officially, for them it is not good," Zelensky said during a press conference. It notes as well that the United States has alleged that China's exports of dual-use goods to Russia is powering the warring country's defense industrial base and warned of Beijing of consequences for such support, a claim Beijing has refuted, saying it has not provided weapons to either side and maintains tight export controls on dual-use goods. It's not happening. They're being dishonest, right? And notes as well that Zelensky alluded to such support in comments Sunday, saying certain elements that make up parts of Russia's weaponry come from China. And so it's coming out, frankly, folks. And as I've discussed before, remember the deeper context in this. Why would the Chinese Communist Party want to draw out the war between Russia and Ukraine? Why would the Chinese Communist Party not want there to be peace talks? It's because the Chinese Communist Party wants to draw the United States into 4 separate wars. Again, this comes from one of the main advisors to the Chinese Communist Party, the strategy that they've apparently adopted. They believe that if China were to invade Taiwan, that they could not withstand the pressure from the United States and other Western countries coming to Taiwan's defense or funding Taiwan. So what do they have to do? They have to make sure that the United States is busy with other wars. The U.S. military is very unique because of the geographical landmass we have, right? We're made to fight 2 separate wars because we have an East Coast and a West Coast with a very large landmass in between. We have a very powerful Pacific military. We have a very powerful Atlantic military. And the U.S. military is designed to be able to fight wars on 2 separate fronts, including against 2 separate countries. And so if America is built to fight against and even win against 2 different countries, what is the CCP thinking? Well, make sure it's more than 2 countries. You can't just have a war in Russia with Ukraine. You can't just have a war with the Chinese Communist Party. They said there needs to be a terrorism war. The CCP, in its original writings, even wanted a conflict in Latin America with Brazil, which I think is off the table now, but we do see potential war over Guyana. And so, given the circumstance, given, for example, some of the chaos happening in the world, given the real stoking of the flames of what appears to be a terror war, and the Chinese Communist Party meeting with terrorist leaders, including, for example, the Palestinian Authority, and including, for example, the Taliban, shortly, in fact, before the Taliban took over Afghanistan. The CCP is building those networks of influence, and not to mention the fact that they have very close ties with Iran, which is, of course, the main sponsor of global terrorism. What do we see now? Well, you can see on the surface that there's many conflicts happening simultaneously. But if you understand that behind all of those is a degree of CCP influence, and if you understand as well that behind that influence are public statements from Chinese Communist Party advisors that they want to do this, that they need these exact conflicts, then it starts to make sense. So why would the Chinese Communist Party want to draw out the war in Ukraine? Well, there's again a lot of reasons to it. That's one of the big ones. Of course, another big one is they're making a lot of money off it, but that's another issue. But on another note, Zelensky was saying that Russia was pressing China. It's possible it's Russian pressure. That's what Zelensky's been saying. Personally, I'd say it's likely the other way around, though. Not saying that Russia doesn't have its own interests, but I don't know what those are, right? And on the topic of the Chinese Communist Party's desire for 4 wars and their plans to infiltrate the United States, I've extensively covered this issue in my years as an investigative reporter. In fact, my documentary, The Final War, talks about all of this. It traces back to the beginning of the Chinese Communist Party to reveal its 100-year plot to defeat the United States of America. If you're interested, you can watch that documentary. It's very important right now, I'd say, because a lot of what I warned about is now happening on the surface. You can watch that exclusively on epictv.com.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
Chairman Mao with the Prime Minister. Our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China.
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving up our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.
Well, everyone, that's all for tonight. Thank you for joining us. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free.